Back in 1968, a book was quietly published by a Stanford professor named Paul Ehrlich with assistance from his wife, Anne Ehrlich. It was called Depopulation Bomb. And basically it was about the threat to the world. If we don't bring population under control, some really bad stuff is going to happen in the very immediate future. Well, the book didn't get a lot of attention immediately, but over time, people started to pick it up. The intelligentsia and a lot of the social advocacy people, a lot of the more liberally inclined people, got a hold of this book and started to develop policies that would, well, work to reduce global population. It seemed like a very simple-minded response to what was predicted by this college professor, but the results and the devastation of such thinking have been profound, and we're going to get into that today. Let's get into it. A big welcome to you. If you're not subscribed, take a second to hit that subscribe button and bell for all notifications. I'm going to irritate some people over in 2025 because not only do we do vintage audio and crabbing and metal detecting and demonstration cooking and fun live streams, but we also get a little bit serious too. And right now the world is in a pretty serious and precarious state. There's going to be a lot of big changes that are going to be coming up in the coming, if not 2025, in the immediate future. And I'd love you to be a part of the thought process here. Yes, some people might be irritated. I might lose some subscribers along the way. But our culture, our Western world today is suffering from a deficiency of what I call deeper level thinking beyond just simple explanations and supposed cures for problems. And one of the most major ones is the threat that was supposed to come from overpopulation in the world. Back in 1968, when the population bomb was published, and I remember even as a young child of 10, 11, 12 years old, all of a sudden hearing this fury of this population growth is it's gonna be horrible. And I was a member of a big Catholic family, right? And all of a sudden people are kind of looking like, oh man, you're part of the problem, right? You all don't know how to control yourself, and to look at what's happened to the world here. Well, that's kind of the humorous aspect of it. But fast forward today, where they're giving out prizes in Russia if you can kick out 10 kids or whatever. You're like you win the Russian Medal of Freedom or whatever. Man, how the worm has turned here. But some of the crazy predictions that Dr. Ehrlich, not an economist, right, not a philosopher, but a biologist, right, engaged in some of the most horrific linear thinking in the history of the world by assuming that population growth would just continue in a linear fashion with no change in direction whatsoever until everything went to hell. Well, the problem with that, and some of his predictions were just incredible. By 2000, England was supposed to have disappeared as a nation, along with India was supposedly doomed. And he predicted that by 1980, the life expectancy of the United States would be 42 years of age. Just like slightly off the mark there. But the problem is, and as ridiculous as they turned out to be, they set off in motion a trend of changes that got into high levels of governments through foundations for population control, things like Planned Parenthood, where it was determined that, well, we had our great growth days here. We had our Gilded Age with large families of 10, 15, 18 children or whatever. But now when we look at you guys, right, if we're going to keep what we have here, we need you guys to stop reproducing at such a prodigious rate. And all sorts of envoys, programs, activities were undertaken to stem world population growth. But the point is the population did continue growing. And one of the main reasons is because, well, know it or not, instinctively, we are born to procreate as a species here on Earth. In the Bible, in the book of Genesis, and you may poo-poo the Bible and faith and all that, but it says, the Lord said, God said, be fruitful and multiply. And it turns out now, some tens of thousands of years later, and millions of years in evolutionary history, that the population growth and population growth in general is the canvas upon which economic success and increasing standards of living are built. No greater gains in standards of living were achieved from the time the population bomb was published in 1968 until about the turn of the millennia. Well, in a lot of ways, a lot of dynamics changed in women in the workforce and other things. That's a whole other issue. Guaranteed to get people riled up and get people freaking out, not just at me, but other people too. But there's a whole deeper side to that we'll explore at a later time. But now we face the threat of global depopulation. In other words, how do you cope with supporting a society which is aging to the point that the world no longer has net births in total, but it starts to have net deaths that exceed net births? That's a very difficult situation because you have this huge bubble of people that are aging and moving upward, and they're being replaced by a narrower and narrower pyramid of people to take on the responsibility, the duty, or the political mandate to keep society moving forward. And it's quite something to have to burden people with. And I'm talking about all across the world. By 2100, India will have crossed over into net depopulation mode. And really, sub-Saharan Africa is one of the last places on Earth that still experiences a pretty prodigious growth rate. Otherwise, in places like England, Ireland, France, much of Germany, Asia, Korea, Japan, Malaysia, I can go on and on and on, Taiwan and countries like this. The net birth rate has been dropping below replacement rate for several years now. Add in some of the stupidity that of thinking that characterized much of the pushback from the book, The Population Bomb, like in 1975, China began considering the one-child policy. And by 1980 until 2015, that was in full force. And then what happened someday somebody woke up and said, hey, man, if this goes on, we're going to be in serious, serious trouble. And now you have this whole panic of, we need you to give these young people time out, give them some time to be lovey-dovey and bring kids into the world. It's not that easy. And in the course of only the time since that policy went into force, now the population of China from 1.2 billion people is going to drop to 800 million people by the turn of the next century, which is, well, it's a tremendous, it's going to drop by at least 1/3 to 1/2. What will become of this Chinese society then? Well, we're already seeing the costs of that now, coupled with a severe economic depression. It's not a happy scene, okay? That is a real model for what happens when you see what badly instituted, hold on a minute, that CO detector gone into test mode. But anyway, right, we can see the results of that sort of policy. Not only did probably well over 100 to 150 million children become aborted over that period of time, sadly, especially females, but it also led to a disordered society where, you know, this sacrificing for that one child now is the elderly people's whole life. And well, who knows how that turns out in the end. What's happened in a lot of cases is China turned its back on thousands of years of ancestral, familiar support of each generation supporting the generation that came before, to now sort of becoming a dog-eat-dog world where, well, the old folks are a drag now, okay? And I'm just waiting for them to move on so that I can have their flat. The implications of all this, as you can see, have been tremendous. And for China, it was the equivalent of loading a gun and just shooting yourself in the foot going forward. But in many other ways, the same policies were carried out in other countries too. But now the threats are real as we move into the future. So where is all this going today, you might ask? It's going here. A lot of people recently in my chats over the last year, because of an election year, we've had a lot of discussions about why do we have so much unblocked or just there's no pushback against the migration illegal that's going on in the country, or even legal in places like the EU and other places, right? They've had so much net immigration over there, places like Canada and other places. It's totally destabilized the cultures of the nations. But I tried to think to myself, why is this going on? I mean, why would this take place? Why would people unwittingly load so many people into a nation? Excuse me. Getting over a little flu here, but why would the governments allow so much of this going? Well, because for one reason, people are now the new raw material of economic success. They're becoming scarcer. They're becoming scarcer and more valuable in the world. And I firmly believe, as leadership around the world looks at the population, the depopulation threat coming and unfolding before our very eyes right now. In Japan, they'll almost give you a house for free, right? Because there's no young, like Korea, it's such an aged society. It's like there's too much house. It's built for a bigger population, right? And now it's a case of what the hell do we do? Well, this is the difference between the Occidental, which is the West, and the Oriental, which is the East. So Oriental societies tend to be more homogeneous in nature. In other words, net migration into places for Korea and China. I got to China to apply to become a citizen, right? I lived in China for 5 years. I speak Chinese, right? But the chance of me getting citizenship in China is about zero. I don't fit the profile, even though I make great Chinese food and, yak it up with the waiters and waitresses at Chinese restaurants. It's the old ingrained China for Chinese only, Koreans for Koreans only, Japan for Japanese only. Therefore, in Asia, they're in a much more difficult position when it comes to the future, right? Because the net replacement, no matter what the government does, and the indebtedness of these governments is great. You cannot pay people to have children unless you're willing to commit to see that all the way through to they're raised and successful. People have a natural pushback and say, I got eyes, I'm looking around here. I hear what you're telling me, but I just can't get in an amorous mood when I see young people living in subway tunnels and stuff like that all over places like China. And it's a mess. So what I'm saying, it's a much more intractable problem over there. In the Occidental nations, the tendency has just been to grab everybody you can now, get them into the nation, let the pain be, right? Let it filter through. History shows we have big immigrations, big flows of people. Yeah, we have chaos for a few decades, but then everybody settles down and becomes American or becomes Canadian or whatever. But not always the case, right? Right. A lot of these landed migrants and people that move to these nations, they take what they find there of resources and things, and many of them, in many cases, in large numbers, something to the tune of $1 trillion in the United States. In 2022, they're sending their remittances back to their home countries because they don't intend to, retire in the United States, and they've left the wife and kids behind. Their intention is not to live here. It's to take the work effort out and to send monies back and support yourself. Maybe I see it in my own neighborhood with many families and single guys sharing one rental. They do what they got to do, right? I don't fault anybody for that. It's a natural order of the way things are right now. But that immigration does not have the net positive effect that traditional immigration was. Man, I just closed the door on the old world, right? They'd ask families in the 1920s and 40s, did you Italians, did you ever go back to the old country and visit? What the hell, are you kidding? I couldn't wait to get the hell out of there, right? Well, I don't want to see those mopes back. The attitude is far different today. So in a lot of ways, the whole point I'm making here is the world is now suffering, particularly in the West, because we're trying to offset some of the societal changes in the 60s that have wreaked havoc on our civilization. We're going to get into some of them in the future, and they're going to be controversial, and they're sure going to piss some people off, I know that. But we need to keep an open mind and be realistic about things, and we can't always operate from a prideful point of view. So at the current time, when we look at a country like Canada that would go along, beautiful country, they would let 200,000 people in a year, 250,000 people a year. Yeah, you get a little bit of grumbling, but yeah, okay, we can move over a little bit. Yeah, I'll make a little bit of room for you. Right? Canadians are the kindest people on the face of the earth, right? Now we fast forward to the pandemic where everything's slowed down. It really put a major nail in the coffin of population growth. Now all of a sudden it's like, wow, we better get some immigrants into this nation. And all of a sudden you have a country that's dealing with 6 times and 8 times the number of 1.25 to 1.5 million people a year. The effect on that of a relatively small population base has been dramatic. And it can also be destabilizing too, as we'll talk about in a future video, particularly to young people who get an idea in their head, where do I fit in the pecking order of what's going on in this nation? I was born Canadian, right? My parents are Canadian, and now I'm having to compete with people that are migrants into my nation. And I can't even afford to rent an apartment anymore. Right, something like the average wage in in Chicago's 30% higher than the average wage in Toronto, yet housing in Toronto is 30% more expensive than in Canada. And as recently as 1970s, 1980s, Canadian and the United States GDP per person were about even, and now Canada is about 30% beyond that. So it's a lot to choke on and absorb when you take in this population, right? This, I believe, is what is going on now. That we can talk about human trafficking and the Harvey Weinsteins and the Hollywoods and things like that, but there's also governmental trafficking of humans taking place on a massive scale today. And the United States is no different. The floodgates were opened post-pandemic into this nation, and well, it puts the United States kind of in a unique position because we're not in immediate danger at least for the next decade or so, of depopulation, or a situation where the death rate exceeds the birth rate. How long that'll last, I don't know. The elements are in place to control that, to reverse that, and then remove that. And well, that could be a stand by, right, for News at 11 on that. We don't know how that'll work. But we have to be aware of very simple-minded solutions to what is stressing us at the current time. That's my point here today. And my point also is to show you how off-base the thinking can become when the wrong person with the wrong ideas captures the headlines and attentions and gets governmental thinking around the world going in a certain direction. The results, as today proves, can be absolutely catastrophic. We're going to be dealing with major issues coming up here. So much that, well, we can almost look at Europe right now and say, it almost looks like the UK, parts of France, right, parts of Germany and Ireland and stuff. It almost looks like we're just, we're starting to circle the drain, so to speak, over there. It's getting so bad because the amount demanded out of society far exceeds the amount that society can produce to support what it has. To reach a point where we even have pensioners now that are fighting to hold on to their 300-pound annual heating allowance to be able to keep themselves warm in their homes. More and more programs need to be means tested, which means more and more people get cut out, particularly people that have been born and raised citizens of those particular nations. It promises to be a very interesting future, and I believe that the chickens will be coming home to roost really soon. But for the time being, understand that in the scheme of capitalism and life, and capitalism is a natural process. It's not like socialism and communism. It runs itself, right? It's the greatest miracle from God to man is capitalism. But as capitalism unfolds and people try to examine it, you have to understand land, labor, and capital, right? We had surpluses of labor for years, kept prices relatively low. We finally reached with plenty of capital now, rich and wealthy, stocks, bonds, all that stuff. What's lacking is the labor, right? That's the element that's now being raised up for the first time, really since the Dark Ages, when 1/3 of the population of Europe was wiped out. And all the land barons that wanted to keep their estates going could no longer just say, hey, you need to do this, you need to do that. Peasants say, you know what? I survived, dude. I don't have to take orders. I'm moving on somewhere else. This guy's willing to pay me. I get to keep 15% of what I grow, right? And you're not giving me jack, right? So later, so all of a sudden, the benefit to the peasant class was tremendous in that type of environment. Of course, we don't have quite the same scenario today because we don't have the repopulation boom. If there was ever an era of time that you could say to your husband and wife, man, they're dropping like flies at this village. Shit, they're gone. Mayor died, 1/3 the population. This village disappeared. Right, there's nobody left to write in the book of death anymore. I don't think we're going to have kids, right? I mean, can you imagine a time more appropriate for not having children at that time? But yet there was the force of faith and religion and the biblical basis of go forth and multiply that the people knew no better than to really do that. And well, mankind benefited from that. It's quite the opposite situation today, where selfishness is such the rule that more and more people just live for themselves and don't understand when you're not in a position to take care of others. There may come a point in time where there'll be nobody to take care of you. The world in 2025. Anyway, this has been rather long and exhaustive, so there it is. Traffic on a massive scale today. People are the new basic material, raw material of economic success, and open those floodgates. Thanks for watching, everybody. Your comments, and I'm sure there'll be many down below. Be nice, and I look forward to your comments. And once again, if you're not subscribed, subscribe and hit that bell for all notifications. Thanks so much for watching.